Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Maria Sanchez Tucker, and I am the director of the Santa Fe Public Library. And I'm really pleased to introduce the program this evening with authors Bill Piatt and Moises Gonzales to discuss their book, Slavery in the Southwest, Genizaro Identity, Dignity, and the Law. Slavery in the Southwest, Genizaro Identity, Dignity, and the Law frames legal approaches to alleviate the badges of servitude that still linger among descendants of slaves known as Genizaros. The book includes important cultural and historic contexts. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more from the authors on this important topic. So if you're interested in purchasing the book, Carolina Academic Press has generously agreed to a 20% price reduction. And I've placed the instructions on how to order the book from Carolina Press in the chat, and then we'll follow up with an email with the instructions in case you'd like to order the book online. So we'll leave time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So please leave your questions in the chat or in the questions and answer box. And with that, it's my honor to introduce Bill Piatt and Moises Gonzales. Robert William Piatt Jr., he is a Santa Fe native, so we're really pleased to have him with us tonight. He's a professor of law at St. Mary's Law School, and he specializes in constitutional law. Prior to moving to San Antonio, Piatt served as Assistant Attorney General in New Mexico and later Assistant Public Defender. He has taught and practiced law in New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Illinois, and Texas, and has taught and lectured internationally in Spain, Mexico, Austria, China, Chile, and Argentina. And Moises Gonzales is an associate professor in community and regional planning at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. As a Genizaro heir of 2 land grants in New Mexico, Gonzales has published articles and a book on the history and culture of Genizaro settlements. He is a danzante, or ritual dancer of the Matachin and Genizaro Apache Comanche traditions. So with that, welcome Bill and Moises. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess we'll start with brief introductions of again, just a little kind of about the project, and then I'll go into the presentation. So anyway, so the concept of the book was a collaboration between Bill and myself, and it's pretty much about so Bill and I are both descendants of the Genizaro population in New Mexico, and I'll define kind of like what the definition is and the term and how it became about, and then I'll talk about kind of my historic connection. So the way the book's framed is, my contribution is the historical cultural participant in my community, and also as a researcher of Genizaros and a scholar of Genizaro culture. And then in that collaboration, Bill takes on the concepts of the legal arguments in terms of how do descendants of Genizaros, descendants of slaves, where do their claims of indigeneity fall? When people are taken from their families, from tribes, brought up in through the product of slavery, how and the descendants of various indigenous groups we'll talk about in a little bit. The complexity is, turns into a policy, a legal policy dealing with, with even how do Genizaros even possess sacred feathers that such as an eagle feather or a bird of prey, and complex issues like that. So that's going to be our presentation. Our presentation is going to start with me setting up a historical framework, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill to outline the legal framework that's and issues and questions that are taken on in the book. So a little bit about myself. I know it surprises maybe some of you that I'm a professor in urban design. I'm actually here at the School of Architecture and Planning at UNM right now, where I'm doing the Zoom presentation. And then I write a lot, besides the work that I write about on historic preservation. I teach in the area of historic preservation in urbanism, but it's primarily from my background of growing up within a Genizaro community, and understanding, and participating in rituals from a Genizaro community. And from that, I'll mention some of the different Genizaro communities that exist in New Mexico, then talk about a little bit how that relates from the past, the colonial period, to the present day, to how do Genizaros exist in their cultural community in New Mexico, and then that'll give you the historical context. So both of my grandma and my grandpa on my dad's side are from a place called Carnuel, which maybe you've heard of the town of Carnuel. It's located in Terrace Canyon, and also a member of the Las Huertas land grant, which is Placitas, New Mexico. Excuse me. So if we look at going back to a little bit of history, right? So after the Pueblo Revolt changed a lot of things in New Mexico, things that are even being debated right now in the community of Santa Fe, right? But one kind of important thing that happened in the 17th century, so the Pueblo Revolt happens. Piatt, as one of the organizers of the principal organizers of the revolt, wanted to return Pueblo society to a more traditional, conservative, pre-colonial society, right? So one of the things that, after the Pueblo Revolt, a lot of the horses made their way out to the plains of eastern New Mexico. If you think about Las Vegas, if you think of east of Albuquerque, going out towards the plains, towards Edgewood, out towards Moriarty, you're really at the edge of what they used to refer to the Llano Estacado, the state plains, right? And so, you look at, a lot of the sheep were run out, a lot of the Navajo toward the west and pick up the sheep. The Utes become a very transformative society. They get the horse, and they basically, along with the Comanche, start transforming the equestrian culture and adapting what we think about the plains equestrian cultures. Really starts with the Comanche to the Kiowa at a certain extent, which be northeastern New Mexico, and the Ute, and then of course we had a number of the nomadic Apache groups, right? The Jicarilla, which were generally out towards the plains, also toward the plains, out towards Mora, out towards Las Vegas, Raton. You had the Mescaleros down in primarily the southern mountain range. The Chiricahuas, the western Apaches, right, are out towards, out towards the western part. And then you had a bunch of other bands, such as the Ojo Caliente, which were a lot of the bands that landed up in Silver City and around what would be present day Socorro, right? So because of this shift of the Comanches and the Utes, there was a lot of pressure. So what happens in 18th century society of New Mexico is it's almost not, basically it's, we look historically, as a frontier, the New Mexico frontier under Spain was always under a kind of distress, always. I mean, that's something that a lot of scholars could agree on. The stress too was at the point that at the time, by the mid 18th century, by the mid 1500s, you had such a growing population. So the raids that would happen with the Utes onto the Pueblo and Hispano settlements is there was a lot of warfare that were going where captives were taken from communities out to the plains and traded, and other captives were brought in, to the point that in 1733, you had such a huge Genizaro population. Some of them started to ask for their own settlements. They didn't even, some of these settlements of these petitions that were asked for, they weren't even actually in necessarily in Pueblo communities or Hispano communities. In fact, some of the priests even actually go in to define that Genizaros are of their own people. They're of their own. They're not Hispanic and they're not Pueblo Indians. They're kind of a mix on their own, and therefore they should start having their own settlements. Fast forward to the 1750s, you had one guy by the name of Tomás Vélez Gachupin who who really becomes the architect of Genizaro settlements of New Mexico. He envisions that if you have Santa Fe to the north, or the Via de Santa Cruz in present-day Española, the Via Santa Fe, the Via Albuquerque, he figured then you had all these other settlements around it. He figured if you could do this architecture of settlements around the middle Rio Grande, then you could start defending. So in a sense, Genizaros then become the project of these borderland communities in mountainous terrains, right? So you have Belen is the first. You have Belen set up by Genizaros. It's actually called the Plaza Los Genizaros. Then you have the Pueblo de Barbecue. You have some of the settlements like Truchas, around Truchas, Trampas, it becomes settlements over to the Mora Valley, Mora Pass, Ranchos, the Taos becomes a major settlement. Then around Albuquerque, you have the Cañón de Carnue, which is basically the Tijeras Canyon. You have the Las Huertas, which is the north end of the Sandias. And then the last one that's pretty well known is along as Jemez Pueblo's declining because of the raids on the Comanche. Pueblo, as we know, a lot of the Towa, Jemez, the Towa, Peco-speaking people moved to Jemez. And then it's the Genizaros, who we think about Santa Fe. After the Tlaxcalans kind of like amalgamated into mestizo society, Analco for most of the 18th century was kind of like where a lot of the Genizaros lived within Santa Fe. So guess what? The last settlement, one of the last known land grants is the San Miguel Elevado that's established out towards to protect the raids from the Pecos area. Fast forward today, it's estimated, a lot of scholars put the estimation of at the end of the 18th century that the population of Genizaros was 1/3 of New Mexico's population. So it's pretty significant. So kind of one of the things, if you look at today we think about the usual aspects of who are Genizaros, they tend to be the ones that are Abicu, if you go to the feast days of Abicu, you can't now because of COVID, but the Fiestas San Tomas, you think about some of the dances of the Matachinas and Alcalde, or where I'm from in Carnuel, where we have two genres of dances in the Sandia Mountains, which are the Matachinas and the Comanches. Or you go to Ranchos de Taos, where you'll see different dances of the Comanches. So you have all these kind of like how communities through the land grant system, where land grants still survive, in these land ownership patterns with the history of these descendants that still live within a community. Recently, in recent years, genetic testing, genealogy, people are, questioning kind of their history. And, the thing is, for example, in my family, the basis of our economy after the De Anza's peace accord, which created the Ute-Comanche alliance, by the early 1800s, a lot of buffalo hunters are going and hunting in the plains. And like my family, in our community, in the East Mountains, we would leave for the buffalo hunts in October, or people would, and they wouldn't come back till December. And they would trade items. They would take salt that they would get from the salt beds of the Quarai missions, and then take out the salt, trade with the Comanche, trade tobacco, different things, bring captives back. And then then they'd actually be sold in the plaza. Pretty well known that slaves and servants were sold on the Santa Fe Plaza, just like in Albuquerque. To the point that we even have songs, and I'm going to sing one real quick that we know about, and it's cited in the book, where Bill talks about when me and El Comanche are singing on the Taos Plaza, and it goes like this: El Comanche, la Comancha, el Comanche, la Comancha, se fueron pa Santa Fe, a vender sus hijitos, a vender sus hijitos, por azúcar y café, por azúcar y café. Hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, oh, oh, oh. Hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, oh, oh, oh. Hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, oh. And so that's a folk song that's even remembered. And what it goes is that, the Comanches, they took a kid to Comanche boy, little woman, and were sold in Santa Fe for sugar and coffee as a form of trade. So, we know that, in my family, even though we were the products of Genizaros, by the time the Mexican period, which, slavery, and we'll go into this. I think slavery under the Mexican period was probably the worst because campaigns of extending grazing lands and forests by the elite Mexican officials, which, a lot of the militia of New Mexico were out having to do these campaigns against the Navajos and the Apaches, to the point that it started a rebellion, the Chimayo Rebellion, in 1837 by a Genizaro who was governor at one point, Governor Gonzales. But anyway, so that's the historical framework. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill, how Genizaros against. I just want to leave, but as you that all from Santa Fe. So again, I just wanted to say that now, as people are questioning their identity, they're finding when people do like research and be like, oh, my grandma was traded, great grandma was a servant in a wealthy family. We always thought we were Spanish. We were the Hispano elite in Santa Fe. And they're finding out that there's this connection. So Genizaros didn't just, we think about a lot of them that stayed in these villages, but the way the slave markets work, people popped up all over the place. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Moises. I always enjoy listening to your presentation. I learned so much from you, and I have learned so much. Okay, so this is our book. I don't know if it's come out backwards on your screen, but it is Slavery in the Southwest, Genizaro Identity, Dignity, and the Law. Just by way of introduction, we write about the Genizaro experience primarily because that's our background. But the legal principles that I'm going to discuss apply to, and we in fact address the concerns of other non-federally recognized indigenous people, like the Lumbees in North Carolina, like the American Indians in Texas. The book talks about identity, and we take up the issue of what gives a government the power to tell people who we are. We take up the discussion of dignity. How does a culture, how does a nation maintain and transmit its culture and its spirituality in the context of an onslaught, trying to eradicate it? And then we talk about the law. And I'm happy to say that this is the first time that there has been a legal analysis of the rights of non-federally recognized indigenous people. But let me also say, by way of preface, the federal government admirably and rightfully has tried to make some amends for the horrible mistreatment of the Indians. But they've excluded, by narrowly defining who they get to recognize as Indians, a tremendously large population of indigenous people and nations. And so I'm going to explore in this brief discussion we discuss in the book, who is an Indian in the eyes of the law? What is an Indian tribe in the eyes of the law? Why does it matter? And then we'll talk about some strategies, including whether or not nations and tribes should even seek recognition, and then ultimately looking to state law, federal law, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So with that, let me just jump into a discussion of who is an Indian. The simple answer is it's a person who is defined as an Indian by the law. But that's not a very good answer, because in the Constitution of the United States, even though Indians are mentioned twice, there's no definition. There are federal statutes of the United States that define Indians in at least 33 different ways. And sometimes they provide benefits and don't even define who it is that's eligible to receive them. One place that's critical, that's important, is the US Census Bureau. People have the right to self-identify when filling out the census forms. It's too late now for this year, but think about it 10 years from now. Write yourself a note. The United Nations Declaration that we're going to talk about recognizes the rights of people to self-determination and a right to maintain their own identity. So who is an Indian? If you're talking about the federal government, it's who the federal government says is an Indian. And basically the federal government says an Indian is somebody who belongs to a tribe that we, the federal government, recognize. All right, how does a tribe get federal recognition? Within the federal government, in the executive branch, there is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, created to act as trustee for the Indians that it was going to recognize. There is a horribly complex system of regulations where if a tribe wants to be recognized, they have to submit an application. We include the regulations as an appendix. They're horribly complex. There are tribes like the Lumbees that have tried for 80 years to get recognized. if you made an application, you would have to show identification as an American Indian identity on a substantially continuous basis since 1900. You'd have to show that 50% of the members of the group either reside in an exclusively or almost exclusive area. There are some other things. I think Genizaros could meet all of these easily. Certainly the communities in Abiquiu individually, the Tortugas Pueblo, Canoe, others. But here's the kicker. The group also has to show that its membership consists of individuals who descend from a historical Indian tribe. How can the descendants of slaves, especially when their ancestors were captured as children, how can they identify the tribe to which their child ancestor belonged? It's almost impossible. It's a bureaucratic nightmare, but within the federal government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs could do that. Another way is to get the United States Congress to recognize your tribe. But think about it. How much political influence do you think a small group of people, or even a relatively large group of people, there may be 1 million or more Genizaros, but how much influence do you think they would have to persuade a majority of the House of Representatives, the Senate of the United States, and the President of the United States to sign off on a federal recognition? There's some litigation strategies. People could seek recognition from the federal courts. That would take years. You got to have money and resources for all of these things. And it leads people to say, look, for a number of reasons, why even bother? Why do we need to have a government tell us who we are? What difference does it make? There are some benefits to the federal recognition, as Moises has suggested, for religious use of eagle feathers, peyote, use of Indian lands for hunting, affirmative action, any number of contexts, and gaming, of course, being a biggie. There is a motivation, at least for some purposes, to gain recognition. And in fact, the federal government recognizes over 500 tribes, 23 in New Mexico. But it doesn't recognize the clusters of people that have lived in the area, that have practiced the culture, that insist on maintaining an identity without going through all the hoops of the federal government. Now, there's also a possibility of getting state recognition. So the state of New Mexico would recognize a nonprofit corporation, an entity could incorporate as the Genizaro Nation or whatever other identity, and they have the right to do that. First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States gives people the right to associate. And then on an individual basis, there may be some strategies. Assume for just a minute that it may just not be worth it morally, financially, legally to try to pursue federal recognition. But what about individuals in a community that want to go to college, that want to get a job where there is an affirmative action consideration? If they are not a member of a tribe and yet they are indigenous, how do they prove that? Or what should they do to prove it? So Moises and I and another person, Katja Wolf, an attorney from Germany who came to study at my institution, we also wrote a law review article talking about the affirmative action within law schools in terms of Genizaros or Indians. So you all know about the background of affirmative action. In a law school, somebody applies, they identify themselves as African American or Hispanic. There's no identity police. There's no race police to go check on their identity. But if they claim Native American status under the regulations of the American Bar Association, they've got to prove it. And the regulations say they can prove it by tribal identity, or they can prove it by demonstrating Indian heritage, sufficient contact with the culture, et cetera. We surveyed the law schools. We surveyed 25 law schools, including the top law schools in the country. Guess what? They're not following their own guidelines. So if, it raises a question, why should Native Americans have to prove their identity in any event? Why should a Native American person with a tribal enrollment card have to show that when African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, there's no race police for those categories? And then there's a double discrimination, because if the school does say, all right, we will give you recognition as a Native American, now prove it, show us your papers. Their own guidelines say that you can submit a heritage statement. And by the way, on page 110 of our book, here it is, page 110 of our book, we provide a template that could be used for people who are trying to take advantage of affirmative action programs. That doesn't answer the legal issue or the moral issue of whether people should pursue it. But at least in our book, we go through a number of strategies, including litigation, how individuals could assert that their rights to equal protection are being violated because their heritage is being denied, the right to due process in terms of an identity, drawing some parallels and not arguing in favor or against this. But Right now, the Supreme Court has determined that in an employment context, employers can't decide what a person's gender identity is. So that a person who has a genetic profile of being a male can identify legally as female. And yet a Native American who has a tremendously high DNA percentage, but no tribal membership because their ancestors were stolen, can't qualify as Native American. And so we think there are some equal protection, due process, a number of other problems. One other source that I want to talk about, and that is the United Nations. In 2007, the United Nations issued its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Long story short, the United States finally signed off on it. There is no country on the face of the earth out of 147 signatories, there's no country that opposes it. And it provides an important framework. There's no enforcement mechanism. You can't go get the United Nations to come here and sue somebody, but they could send reporters, and they've done it in Australia, New Zealand, and some other areas. And we include the entire declaration because of several very important points. First of all, within the declaration and its interpretation, self-identification as indigenous or tribal is regarded as the fundamental criterion for determining the groups to which the provisions apply. Self-determination, self-identification. In the preamble, there's this important consideration, affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. And then within the framework of the declaration, which we include in full, is the 46 articles, including indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal to all other people, have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination, and the exercise of their rights, in particular, that based on their indigenous origin or identity. I could envision a situation where Genizaros, where other non-tribally affiliated people ask the UN, send a reporter, prepare a report, bring it to people's attention. There are some serious issues that are being overlooked. On the maintenance of culture, Moises is the expert on it. I've had the good fortune to watch the Matachinas dances that he's been in Canhuac. Moises and I went to Abacu Pueblo last November for the Feast of Santo Tomas, watched the beautiful dancing, participated in the feast. We went south to Tortugas Pueblo in December, a pilgrimage to the top of a mountain with a Catholic Mass. Here in San Antonio, Texas, I've had the honor to participate with the American Indians in Texas in prayers at the Alamo, which is the northernmost of 5 missions. The Alamo was a Catholic mission for more than 100 years before the battle. Every year, American Indians in Texas gather, pray at the burial grounds of their ancestors because Indians worked, lived, died, and are buried at the Alamo, even though now there's an attempt to dig them up and create a Disneyland tourist attraction. And then we run south 11 or 12 miles, stopping at each of the missions to pray. So there are many opportunities for people to explore their cultural heritage, to maintain the cultural heritage. And as I suggested, it's more than just a situation involving the Genizaros. It's a broad concern across cultures and across national barriers regarding the rights of indigenous people who the federal governments don't want to recognize. Moises started with a song. I can't sing it, but I'm going to read the words that we conclude with to another one that circulated in northern New Mexico for centuries. Los inditos de San Juan piden pan y no les dan. En el tronco del corral comenzaron a llorar. Roughly translated, the little Indian children of San Juan Pueblo ask for bread, but none is given to them. In the corner of the corral, they begin to cry. Kind of a painful summary of the capture of children, slaves, who lost their identity, whose ancestors now struggle with the badges of servitude that have carried over for generations and generations, but who now see a way out. So we ask in the book to think about the injustices that have occurred, but don't focus on that. Think of the justice that could be brought to Genizaro and other Indian children who have not yet been recognized by our federal government, by our society. Concept of human rights is not a zero-sum game with only a fixed amount of dignity available to be divided among competing populations. We conclude that it's time to recognize and celebrate this indigenous identity. It's time for the birth, or rather the rebirth, of the Genizaro nation. Thank you. We might have time for questions. I see one popping up.
Some questions?
I see one that I might address.
Sure. I can read a few to you. There was a question that said, what is that word for descendant? Were you talking about the Genizaro word, or was there a different word for descendant?
I don't, we were talking about.
I just said the heirs, meaning the heirs of Genizaros.
Okay. Were there Genizaros in Chamita, New Mexico? And do you know about any of the history of the Salazars?
Moises, I'll let you do that.
Yeah, well, Chamita, I mean, again, when I mentioned about like how movements within families and, you know, the population of 1/3, it's, if you figure like, you know, how many, if you can trace your family to colonial times in New Mexico, the Spanish didn't bring women. You know, there was some of the Mexican Indian population that came in with the Tlaxcalas. You know, we look at all the dimensions of folks, you know, Edward Dozier, who is a Santa Clara scholar, talks about the rise of Genizaros, was partly after the Pueblo Revolt, when, you know, some people were actually pushed out of some of the Pueblo communities because they were trying to get back to the strict cultural ways. So you have that segment. So then you have the different the different campaigns that the Spanish did against the Comanche, the Ute, the Apache, the Dene, the Navajo. I mean, for example, in my background, I have, because I trace back to some of the Genizaros that were part of the land and then landed up in a place called Valencia, and then migrated, and then eventually landed up in Carnuel. I mean, in my some of the documents go far as folks that were captured that are in the Spanish documents as Panana, which is Pawnee. So we figure how the extents of this, you know, the Utes, in terms of when they were aligned with the Spanish, they were getting a lot of Paiutes. So even Paiutes came as far and traded in. So I would just encourage them maybe to do more research. I'm sure, you know, Chamita's on the corridor to Abiquiu, and Abiquiu is the quintessential Genizaro Pueblo. So, you know, so I would just encourage them to do more of the research into their genealogy.
One other thing I might add too is just think about the history for just a minute. Let me back up. I'll take just a few minutes. So we all know Columbus lands in 1492. In the 1500s, the Spanish move into Mexico. The Spanish moved north into what's now New Mexico. Why did they come? Number of reasons. One is they were looking for gold, 7 cities of gold. When Merida in Spain fell to the Moors in 1150, there was the legend that 7 bishops fled with boats full of gold, came to the New World and set up cities out here somewhere. So the Spanish came looking for the gold. The Catholic Church was interested in converting, to extending the faith. The Spanish Empire was interested in extending the Spanish Empire. And then a number of the people that came were adventurers. In Spain, the oldest sons could inherit the property. The second and third sons had to be priests or soldiers, or really had no real access to the wealth. So they came looking for that. The Spanish did not bring many women. They didn't bring a labor force. So when they get to what's now New Mexico ultimately, and the Southwest, they captured the Indians and put the Indians to work. And they also found they could purchase Indians from other Indians who had been engaged in slavery before the Spaniards even arose here. In terms of the pursuit for the 7 cities of gold, the Spanish moved north. They moved through what's now New Mexico. They kept moving north at the urging of the natives they were talking to. You can just envision them approaching some indigenous people and saying, we're looking for the 7 cities of gold. And the Indian saying, oh, yeah, go that way, keep going. You're on the way. Well, they kept going all the way to Kansas, got to Kansas, realized there's no gold, came back to what's now northern New Mexico and established Santa Fe. And as Moises had pointed out, and maybe we should have told you the origin of the term Genizaro. It's a variation of a Turkish term, Janissary. During the Crusades, the Turks would capture Christian boys and turn them into soldiers to defend against other Christians coming in. So among the things the Spanish did with the Genizaro population to protect against onslaughts from the Plains Indians, they would give some Genizaros a semi-autonomous existence, create a settlement that would act as a buffer. One of the first was, I understand it is in the Barrio de Analco in Santa Fe, the San Miguel Mission was a Genizaro settlement. All right, in 1680, the Pueblos revolted. They were unhappy with the imposition of the Catholic faith and some of the things that were going on. One of the first series of casualties were the Genizaros in the Analco barrio. There were other Genizaro settlements, as I understand it, set up as defensive perimeters. I think Moises wasn't Canway, a defensive perimeter to protect from entry from the east. Belen in the south, others up north. And so people could trace their descendants by going back to see if there are ancestors who come from that area. But again, if an Indian was stolen, especially as a child, there's no record. And they may pop up in the genealogy rolls as a criada at some point, a servant in a Spanish household, or in the baptism records. All of a sudden, there is a child baptized with a Spanish name who goes to live with a family or even stays at the church. And it doesn't have it, the person doesn't have Genizaro stamped on them, but it's obvious where they came from.
Can a Genizaro high school student apply for college scholarships for college, or are they not recognized as natives and therefore ineligible?
Okay, what they have to do is, the answer is they are eligible, but they're going to have to convince well-intentioned and maybe sometimes not so well-intentioned people of their indigeneity. And like I suggested on page 110 of our book and leading up to it, we provide a template of what people can do to prove that identity. It's not just going and having a blood test, because a blood quantum is not enough. It's a function of maybe some identifiable blood, but presence in the culture, participation in the ceremonies, attendance at rituals. Okay, so there are some people that are going to act in bad faith. That's human nature. There's some people who are going to check a box and say, I'm Hispanic, Black, Native American. We have politicians that claim to be Native American, don't belong to a tribe, have this much Indian blood. I mean, people have all kinds of motivations. But let's assume that there is a Genizaro child interested in furthering an education who wants to maintain the culture. We provide a template how to build a record, for example, since now, and how to present that record, and then hopefully find an attorney to help them if it doesn't work out. I've had the good fortune of working with some of my students. There's at least one of my recent graduates who is representing non-federally recognized Indians in litigation. There needs to be a whole lot more. The process is lengthy and costly. But look at the book, look at page 110, start building that. And even if the person doesn't end up applying, the cultural enrichment from attending the matachines, from participating in the rituals. And New Mexico is so rich, there is so much around that people are not even aware of. And again, we're not trying to slight federally recognized Indians. I have a granddaughter who's tribally enrolled in the Choctaw Nation. But there are people who otherwise should be given opportunities that are not.
We have a few questions about ancestry and DNA. And so I was wondering if you can speak to if you can prove your Native American roots or if there's a genetic database.
I'm not aware of a database. There is a project called the New Mexico, I think it's run by a guy by the name of Miguel Torres. There is a chapter in a companion book that I edited. It's called Nación Genizara. And there's a chapter in there by Miguel Torres that talks about the complexity and aspects of the debates that are going on around Native American DNA. So I think that's the best, the best kind of, I'm not a DNA person, but so anyway.
Okay. Can you address issues of language maintenance and language shift among the Genizaros at the time of slavery and next few generations?
I guess I could maybe give an example from, if you look at how it probably played out. I mean, we could look at the historical record, and then I could look at kind of just some particular examples. Is that even in place names that are around the land grant, they're all, I mean, there's everything from Tiwa, like in fact, the word Carnwe comes from Carné, which is beaver place in Tiwa. If you look at like even the land grant at Chilili, that's a trickling water place in Tiwa, or Tahihi means a place that people gather before they'd go on the buffalo hunt. So and then so there's names and words that pop up that are a mix of stuff that survive in the localized Spanish language. But what happens is, when you have all these different language groups and all these different people living in one village, lingua franca is Spanish was the language of the trade, right? I'm sure definitely there was probably some Comanche spoke, because on the plains, Comanche Comanchero traders would know some of that in trade. So there's documented cases in the archive where Comanchero traders are or even scouts that know different languages, right? But in terms of maintenance, I mean, it's kind of interesting, but those words are almost embedded in connected on the vernacular language of a place. For example, Abacu would have specific words. I know that Carnwe, I'm trying to do a map with different place names that describe which ones are actually Tiwa, which ones are Tanos, which ones are Numeric, Numanuk, Comanche, which ones have different connections to different languages, because so that's also kind of a complexity about Genizaros is, Genizaros probably spoke several languages, but then over time as trade and American domination, I mean, one of the big things with language in general is how many indigenous groups are trying to maintain their languages because of the dominance of the state and assimilation, right? So that's always an issue, right?
There are a couple of questions that are similar. Can you explain the history about Pueblo Indians and Spanish selling slaves on the Plaza of Santa Fe, and how the U.S. turned the Civil War soldiers onto Navajo and Apaches for raiding? And would you walk us through a person becoming a slave?
Well, the way Moises can describe it perhaps better, the way a person became a slave is they got captured either directly by the Spaniards or by Indians, and then they were sold. They were traded to other Indians, or they were traded to the Spanish. There were slave markets at Taos Pueblo, on the Santa Fe Plaza, throughout New Mexico. It's not much of a secret, and you don't have to scratch very far to find that. And then how to prove it, you can't. Oral traditions handed down, the strange breaking in the genealogy, but there isn't any doubt that it occurred. Okay, so Spain had conducted this for years, and then actually Spain decided it would be more humane for the Catholic Church to purchase the children rather than to have them just kind of bought and traded on the open market. So the Catholic Church would actually purchase the slaves and distribute them and keep some of them to work and distribute them. The other thing is that when the Mexican government took over from Spanish rule, they abolished the term Genizaro, but replaced the term with a continuing practice that evolved into what was referred to as peonage. Okay, so when the 13th Amendment was enacted following the American Civil War, peonage didn't disappear. There was a separate law passed by the United States Congress because of the difficulty that the federal government was having recruiting soldiers from New Mexico, because the soldiers would, when the federal government was trying to recruit a soldier, they would say, I can't. I'm owned by my patron, and the patron would say, no, you can't have him. I own him. He's got to work off his indebtedness to me. So the name changed, and actually, unfortunately, we have documented evidence that this patron system, this patronage system, continued into the 1900s. As recently in 1940, 1950, there's litigation over it. And now I've also written a book on human trafficking. It looks like it has evolved into what is now referred to as labor trafficking. So you don't go buy slaves on the Santa Fe Plaza anymore. But if you want somebody to work as a slave, you go online and you can find people. People are brought across by coyotes, and you make contact with coyotes and you buy people for labor, and then you threaten their families back home if they try to escape. And we're not given a primer on how to do it, but it does still occur.
I would just add that, the territorial census are amazing. for example, we could look at like, you could look at, because like what Bill's talking about, the peonage system existed like, into the territorial period. We had to have a particular, rule come down from DC for for emancipating the peonage system in New Mexico. I mean, you could look at the 1860s and 1870s census of any village and you'll see servant, 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 servant. You even look at some of the pueblos, Cochiti Pueblo, there'll be an Apache kid, there'll be a Ute kid, there'll be a Navajo kid. There'll be, and the Pueblos have them and the Hispanics have them. So it's, and you could still find it up to the 1860s and 1870s census. So, I mean, and again, there's, I'm working with folks from the Kiowa tribe that have stories of their family that became part of the Kiowa tribe that were captive from Mexican families. Pretty common in Comanche folklore that in fact, I'm working on my new book now where I document a guy that was stolen from Placitas and landed up making himself all the way to be a Comanche warlord, a chieftain, and then actually just split and became merged back into colonial society. He married a woman from Sandia Pueblo. And so, these movements into these various groups, I mean, we have a whole tribe of a whole clan of the Navajos called the Nakai Dene. That's the Mexican clan of the Navajo. I mean, that's telling right there, right? Where those people came from.
We have so many great questions. So do you think state recognition is possible? And do any New Mexico politicians have knowledge or sensitivity to the issue?
New Mexico does recognize Genizaros. There was a resolution in both houses of the New Mexico legislature in 2007, we included in the book, where Genizaros are specifically recognized. Now, that doesn't give access to all of the federally protected rights that we talked about. It doesn't give access to gaming, to religious exemptions for use of animal feathers, a whole bird feathers, a whole lot of other things that only the federal government says they have control over. But that could be leveraged. That could be leveraged, state recognition, granting some rights and recognitions, and then with the help of the state, making an application to the feds, because it's going to take a lot of resources and time if somebody's interested in pursuing that. But again, we don't urge that people seek federal recognition. We only outline the legal strategy should a community decide it wanted to get to that point. And the whole history of recognition is bizarre because, for example, Abiquiu Pueblo at one point was federally recognized and then somehow lost it. All of a sudden, the federal government just stopped referring to them as a recognized tribe. Nobody knows for sure how that happened. Within the communities, there have been attempts that haven't matured into a formal federal recognition. But in the book, we describe applications from a whole lot of other tribes that are still awaiting processing. We describe the difficulties, but we also put in there a couple of success stories so that if a group wanted to pursue it, there is a pathway and there's at least a template.
Yeah, and not that there's anything on the table. I mean, that's just a process of community consensus, right? Like Abiquiu would date, Tortugas in southern New Mexico. I mean, Carnuel Land would, those are, because a lot of these communities still are still organized in collective communities, right? In fact, Bill might talk about it. I mean, because Bill analyzed the Carnuel Land Grant. We have an elected body. We have a diminished land base, but we still have a land base. Our land grant is recognized by the state as a local government entity. So, I mean, there's enough of a skeleton to start putting, the form together.
All you need is about 80 years and the federal government might act on it, or go get the Congress tax. But no, seriously, Conway probably would qualify. The difficulty would be identifying the tribes from which the constituents of Conway descend. That might be a little bit of a problem, although there is the Apache Comanche connection that might be enough.
So we have another question. Can you talk more about the Barrio de Analco?
We wrote a little bit about it in the book. It was a Genizaro settlement along the area that is now the San Miguel Mission near where I went to high school at St. Michael's High School. I don't know how many people lived there, but it was, and there was no complete accurate records of everything that occurred in the uprising. But when the rebellion occurred, apparently, and Moises can discuss this, apparently that barrio was wiped out. The Genizaro population, the defenders, apparently a lot of resentment against them, and they were one of the first groups to go.
Yeah, there is through the missions. I forget the actual book where Escalante has a description of it, and he's talking about like as the events of the Pueblo Revolt are happening, there's Tlaxcalans that are moving, and some Genizaros are moving along to La Cienega and then start trying to make their way out. But what happens in Analco in the 18th century, you know, it appears that after the Vargas, it also becomes a very heavily Mexican Indian settlement. But then in the beginning and over time, it just, you know, you can look at like the baptismal records, and again, Miguel Torres is the expert on the genealogy on that other book that I mentioned. But if you look at the early records of Santa Fe, it's just, you know, Analco, it says it just person after person is named as a Genizaro or an Indio or from one of these different groups. And they're described as being from the barrio of Analco, right? And so to the point that Tomás Vélez Gachupin, he also set up the land grant at Trampas and also Truchas. So Tomás Vélez Gachupin always has, you know, he's always trying to get this governor, he's always trying to get a population. So he went all the way to Hopi, and there was a group that was disgruntled, or there was a priest that was trying to move some of the Hopi Tewas back to Abacu, and they were the first population, right? But if you look at like Trampas, you look at like later on wasn't Tomás Vélez Gachupin, but you look at San Miguel El Vado, you look at Truchas. It seemed like for the governors of Santa Fe, they always had a group willing from the barrio Analco of Genizaros to send them out to these outpost communities. So that's what we do know about Analco.
There's a question that says, regarding the history of suffrage for Indigenous people, were Genizaro able to participate in the electoral system before their tribally acknowledged counterparts?
Indians in general had a difficult time getting the right to vote. It wasn't really until the 40s or the 50s, I think, by federal statute that was clarified. So I guess maybe one advantage to not belonging to a tribe is that maybe somebody would have been able to register to vote and not have to declare participation or membership in a tribe. But I don't know anything specific about Genizaro voting rights. I haven't researched that.
I don't, you know, we can go into Bandelier or Peabody. He was one of the early, he did the ethnography of the Tewa Indians, and he was one of the first ethnographers. And he always had a problem with, even him in his transcription of describing the Tewa at Abacu, he kind of complained about them, that they're a mix of these other tribes and they talk more Spanish than anything else. And they're more like just Mexicans, and he really had a disdain for them. So it's kind of interesting how Abacu played out. So let's put this out, like, you know, United States had a really brutal time during the time of forced relocations, right? Like you look at New Mexico, basically U.S. government was gathering the Jicarillas, moving them to Ute land. They got the Ute land, which were where the Utes were, and they pushed them out even more to Colorado. They tried to move the Navajos to Bosque Redondo. So there's this bloody movement of settling these folks. Where meanwhile, you had the Pueblo Indians where they weren't even recognized as Indians. And maybe you're familiar with this. You could talk about it's the U.S. versus Joseph, I believe, where the Pueblos had to sue the federal government to become wards of the court because they were too civilized as Pueblo Indians because they were farmers and they were Catholic and they lived in a permanent settlement. So even that history is complex. So race and identity in New Mexico, as far as how indigenous people were treated, is a complex history, right? And then if you look at like even my community in Conwell, they weren't going to say they were Genizaros when the U.S. government come in. They were just kind of hoping they wouldn't get captured and hauled off to Oklahoma, right? Where, you know, some of the folks, some Mescaleros actually moved in and become part of the settlement because they were trying to evade being captured by the U.S. Army. So that period's a very bloody history, but actually in the voting rights, it's even complex for Pueblos. It even has a complexity because the Pueblos weren't considered Pueblo Indians because they were too civilized and had to sue for wardship through U.S. versus Joseph. So, I mean, it's a complex history.
And then there's another thing, another sociological issue that we hadn't really touched on too much, but in terms of identity, it was obvious in the system that had developed in New Mexico that being Indian would probably mean you were on the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And so some people would hide their indigeneity. Some of the people that had been captives as kids knew they were Indians, but realized their place in society was not as beneficial if they could somehow avoid being identified as such. So we have seen families where people discouraged their own discovery or their own identity as Indigenous. And then you have the phenomenon recently where people have become interested in DNA testing, and then somebody will take a DNA test and then decide all of a sudden they're this or that or something else just based on the blood quantum. Probably in New Mexico, we represent a mixture of cultures and races and ethnicities. And I suspect that virtually anybody who has any Hispanic blood is going to have indigenous blood, indigenous roots. And at some point, there's not a clear demarcation. And in terms of being Genizaro now, what does it mean now? Well, there are people that are trying to preserve this identity, and there are opportunities to participate in that culture. And it shouldn't be up to a government to make the determination who gets to identify, who gets to participate.
There's a question here. Were not Genizaro criados considered property or chattel? And if so, how did the Catholic Church reconcile that with baptism and confirmation?
Well, from what I understand, the church thought it was doing a good thing by baptizing. It was saving souls. And by taking the saved souls in and distributing them, they were saving them from being captive and sold on the plaza and the other markets. And there was even this horrible situation where a group of Indian children was brought in by another tribal group to be sold. And the Spaniards decided, we don't want to purchase them. No, we're not going to purchase the kids. So the Indian captors beheaded the kids, and the Spanish used that as the justification to say, all right, from now on, we'll use the treasure of Spain to purchase captives so that they don't get beheaded as children.
Yeah, and then I'll just add something to what Bill's saying is that, you know, to look at the concept of the economy, slaves and criadas were part of the economy. I mean, you're using bodies of women and children to support that's economic leverage, right? You, in those days in colonial times, you know, you lose some children as childbirth, you lose some for this, that, you know, you have a workforce. And so, you know, it's a facilitated process. Because let's go to the casta system in New Mexico. Españoles were the highest, and really they weren't even Españoles because, you know, Oñate wasn't even a full-blood Spaniard. He was half, his mom was half Zapotec Indian from Zacatecas, right? So, if you know, the mestizos were the Españoles, really. You know, then you had the Pueblo Indians, and you had all the different, and then Genizaros were barely had souls because they were moved from these tribal nomadic nations into Catholicism. So an Indio Vávaro, which was a Navajo or a Ute or a nomad, they were called Indios Vávaros. They didn't have souls. So the Catholic Church was facilitating. It's like what Bill's saying. It's you know, you're creating a pathway into leveraging a labor force. And the Catholic force and the Catholic Church is somewhat of the legitimacy of that happening.
There's a question here that we know that Native peoples enslaved in the Southwest were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation or by the 14th Amendment. Was there any specific federal law that freed all enslaved Indians and Genizaros?
There was a separate law that we cite in the book directed at the New Mexico peonage system. But again, even though the post-Civil War amendments went into effect, even though that statute went into effect, peonage continued.
Yeah, you know, and it affected the tribes too, because the federal government, if they were removing folks from Bosque de Dando or whatever, it's well documented in other books in New Mexico. I mean, it's talked about in Captives and Cousins, in that book, and some other scholars talk about it. But you know, even the Navajos, even the U.S. government, when they found out there was Hispanic kids, they offered some Hispanic kids, the military would escort them back to where they were from. And some of them were already too integrated in Navajo society, so they didn't want to come. So it wasn't just, I mean, it affected tribes too, because remember, Utes were captively holding people too. So were the Comanche, and so were the Dene.
Did the Spanish keep sale and purchase records for Indian slaves like US do for African slaves? And what is the best source to search for this info?
Census records is the best. I mean, census is, you know, let's go. I mean, let's talk about some families. You have the Elena Gallegos family from the Gurule. It shows who their servants and who they're working for. You have the Gutierrez family in the 1790 census tell you who's where, 1750, 79, 1790. And especially the territorial census will tell you who, I mean, I could tell you like, just some census records that I'm aware where, you know, what Bill's talking about, where you have a list of folks that they're documented under the Piatt system. They just, it's after the last place you'll see is the 1880 census that I've seen, where you'll actually see documented servant.
So there are quite a few questions about where you can find the census and where's the best place to do research. Do you have any suggestions on people who are interested in researching their Genízaro heritage?
State archives is closed. I mean, they're a big thing. A lot of the stuff is on Ancestry now. Yeah, so you can go, you know, you can pull there's a lot of online sources. There's I guess a lot of the genealogy, the New Mexico Genealogy Society, talk to them, and they have books, and they have, like, you can buy the 1790 census for New Mexico in a book, and you can get some of those. The territorial census are publicly, you can publicly access them. You know, but, you know, obviously Ancestry is probably one of the better sources to get that kind of information.
One thing I might suggest, if someone is interested in these topics, of course, besides reading the book, read the book, but besides reading the book, we have a Facebook page, Genizaro Nation Community Forum. It's a closed page, but if you have an interest, send us your interest and maybe we can include you. And then there's over 400 people on that page right now, and somebody on that page might have the information regarding your family.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. One was, historically, if a Genízaro attempted to return to his or her native family, how were they treated by the tribes?
That rarely happened, I don't think. Because once you're set, you know, it's you know, it's complex, right? Because once you're 2 generations removed from being a Kiowa, how do you reintegrate into Kiowa? You know,
and especially since most of the captives were children, they were women and children. So how's a child even going to find their way back or know who their family was? And by the 2nd generation, there's nothing but oral tradition.
So this question says, so if a child is labeled as a servant in the census, is this likely a Genízaro?
I think so. In New Mexico.
A lot of times.
A lot of times.
Almost, yeah, almost always.
So somebody posted familysearch.org has great free records for genealogy and US records. And I'll get the name of the Facebook page and add it to our follow-up email that we'll send out to everybody. And I'll put the names and titles of the book and where you can buy the book online in a follow-up email. And then I think this is a great question to end it on. Somebody asked about where did the Spanish myth come from? And then lastly, what are your thoughts regarding the controversy of the Civil War monument in Santa Fe and the statues of Oñate and de Vargas?
I wrote an article several years ago on the issue of remembering, the difficulty with misremembering. It's a very complex issue. I can make a link to that article available as well. I think there's a fine line between maintaining history and maintaining myths. But I also, in the article, pointed out that sometimes, even though the monument may be offensive, I've had the opportunity to visit Dachau. Nobody wants to preserve Dachau to encourage future concentration camps. They want to preserve Dachau to show the horrors so that people learn from that. Similarly, I've been to a conference in Wannsee in Berlin, where the architects of the final solution gathered to plot the final solution. It's preserved not to encourage future final solutions, but to show the horrors. So I think there is an appropriate preservation and there's inappropriate preservations. It's inappropriate to preserve a monument to maintain a myth.
I would just add, the way that this whole thing was created, I mean, there's a bunch, I mean, you could talk about how the Santa Fe Fiestas was created in the beginning, right? It was created to create tourism. And in fact, the School of Advanced Research actually wrote the script, SAR, their foundation in Santa Fe, they still exist. They wrote the De Vargas thing. So there was a whole creation between the Hispano elite and the Anglos elite early on to look at like the economic viability of New Mexico. In fact, even territorial. A lot of bids that we lost to statehood were because we were too Mexican and too Indian, right? So even you can even look at some of the speeches that are made before Congress. Well, these aren't Mexicans. They're the sons of the conquistadors. So what's embedded in in territorial history and the economic viability of New Mexico by the Hispano and the you could even say tied to the Santa Fe ring, right? You had the Anglo elite and the Hispano elite that create this as a way to create a kind of an imaginary of New Mexico. So I mean, however you feel about Oñate de Vargas, I mean, it's part of that imaginary. It's part of fiestas. It's part of. But I mean, if you look at the records, the actual history of New Mexico and what's taught in schools, and we don't talk about like the part about slavery and if we learn more about the 18th century that created New Mexico and everybody kind of learned that, we'd have a different understanding of what it means to be Pueblo or Genizaro or, a mestizo. It'd be a different place.
Maria, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate this. There were so many good questions and so many good comments. It's almost as if we need to follow up just a discussion to talk about all of this. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library for sponsoring events like this. And thank you once again to Bill and Moises. We really appreciate you taking the time to teach us about this incredible part of our history. And I'm sure if there are a few more questions that we didn't get to, I'll send them your way and maybe we can send out an email. I will send out an email to everybody with the book information. We will also have copies of the book at the Santa Fe Public Library, and we'll send out a few more resources that you can get from the library. We're still doing curbside pickup, so if you want to research more, please call us. We'll help you get the books. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. And check our calendar. We'll have a lot of upcoming programs. So once again, thank you for your support of the Santa Fe Public Library, and thank you to our incredible speakers this evening.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.